Thank you, Dr. Munger. I'm very pleased to be here, particularly pleased to be under the auspices of the Leakey Foundation. I had the pleasure of knowing Louis Leakey, who was a visiting professor at Cornell for many years, and indeed some of my interest and excitement about the question of human origins was stimulated by my conversations with Louis Leakey. And I'm also pleased to participate in this distinguished lecture series in which it is clear that the other speakers have made significant contributions to the study of the origin and evolution of man. What I would like to do is to, first of all, try to set some sense of cosmic perspective about the enterprise that the Leakey Foundation is embarked upon, and secondly, to present some ideas which you may not have heard of on the question of human origins. And to begin, I'd like to start with the first slide, which is a photograph of one of the more attractive planets. This is the planet Earth, and you will recognize the east coast of Africa. You will recognize the periods in the places in, let's see, do I have the wrong continent? I heard someone hiss. Surely this is Africa. It's Madagascar. Has to be right. Okay. Thought for a moment I had my slides mixed up. You will recognize in this picture, it's somewhat cloudy but still discernible, the Kenya, Ethiopia, Afar region, which has been the locale of so many of the most exciting discoveries about early man, and which is the reason that human origins have been pushed back to several millions of years ago. Now, what is remarkable is that several millions of years ago, at the time that the organisms inhabiting this area were called gracile australopithecines and Homo habilis, from orbit it looked precisely as it does today. And that is true back probably some tens of millions of years. Earlier than that, because of plate tectonics and continental drift, the very map of the Earth was different. And so if we were able to have a photograph of the Earth 100 million years ago, it would be remarkably different from what you see here. Now, even photographs taken with superior resolution, as for example the next slide, which is in the Nile Delta region, show not a trace of the existence, much less the origins, of human beings. You must look much closer. Human beings have not profoundly altered the face of the Earth as seen by photographs such as these. You have to look closely to find such a thing as a human being, at least photographically. Now, if I may, I would like to set a kind of time perspective for the evolution of human beings, because when seen correctly, it is an extraordinary event. Its most extraordinary aspect is that it has happened so recently, that intelligence of a technological sort, the emergence of an organism not just smart but able to manipulate its environment, has happened so astonishingly recently in the history of the Earth. So if I can have the lights, I am going to pull out a calendar. The convention which I'd like to use is the only one which I know conveys properly the immense timescales involved. And this is to imagine a calendar of length 1 year, but which is the equivalent of the age of the universe, the 15 billion or so years since that remarkable event called the Big Bang, which is either the origin of the whole universe or at least the earliest event which we are able to date. Imagine that that entire period of time is compressed into the span of a single year. Then it works out that each second is something like 475 ordinary years, and we can state on what date or at what o'clock events occur. And so if we do that, we, for example, can briefly move through pre-December events. And it goes something like this. The Big Bang happened on January 1st, of course. The origin of the Milky Way galaxy happened on May 1st. A lot of months went by before even the galaxy arose. The origin of the solar system occurred on September 9th. Year is almost over before the solar system emerges. The origin of life on Earth, roughly, since we cannot date it precisely, I'll say a little more about that later, roughly September 25th. The date of the oldest fossils, about October 9th. The invention of sex, an event said to be of interest, but in this case by microorganisms. That is invented by microorganisms, not said to be of interest by microorganisms. On November 1st, the oldest fossil photosynthetic plants on November 12th. And the first cells with nuclei, kind of cells that we're made out of, on November 15th. The first worms on December 16th. We're into the last 2 weeks before the worms come out. The first oceanic plankton and the flourishing of trilobites, December 18th. The first fish, the first vertebrates, December 19th. The first vascular plants, the colonization by plants of the land, December 20th, which in this calendar in front of me happens to be a Saturday. The first insects on December 21st. The first amphibians on December 22nd. The first trees and the first reptiles on December 23rd. The first dinosaurs on December 24th. It's Christmas Eve before the dinosaurs emerge. The first mammals on December 26th. The first birds on the 27th. The first flowers on December 28th. Also on December 28th, by some unimaginable catastrophe, the dinosaurs become largely extinct. On the 29th of December, the first primates. On the 30th of December, the early evolution of frontal lobes in the brains of primates, which I think is a critical evolutionary event. Also, the first hominids, the first members of the family, but not the species and genus of man. And then, on December 31st, the first humans. Now, I would like to spend just another moment looking more closely at that last day. These are from the proofs of a book of mine, so they're so unwieldy. The origin of proconsul and Ramapithecus, thought by many students to be ancestors of apes and men, is about 1:30 in the afternoon of December 31st. The first true humans, and in fact this date, this time I'm about to mention, is due to the researches of Mary Leakey, about 10:30 p.m. on December 31st. The widespread use of stone tools about 11 p.m., the domestication of fire by Peking man about 1146. Extensive cave paintings in Europe, 1159. And for the following events, I'm going to have to give a more or less second-by-second recounting. The invention of agriculture at 1159 and 20 seconds. Neolithic civilizations and the first cities, 1159 and 35 seconds. The first dynasties of Sumer, Ebla, and Egypt, and the development of astronomy, a significant event in the history of this planet, 1159 and 50 seconds. The invention of the alphabet, the Akkadian Empire, 1159-51. the Hammurabic legal code in Babylon, the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, 1159-52, bronze metallurgy, Mycenaean culture, the Trojan War, Olmec culture, the invention of the compass, 1159-53, iron metallurgy, First Assyrian Empire, Kingdom of Israel, founding of Carthage by the Phoenicians, 1159-54, Ashokan India, Qin dynasty China, Periclean Athens, birth of Buddha, 1159-55, Euclidean geometry, Archimedean physics, Ptolemaic astronomy, Roman Empire, birth of Christ, 1159-56. An extremely significant moment, the invention of zero and decimals in Indian arithmetic, and incidental events, the fall of Rome and Muslim conquests, 1159-57. Mayan civilization, Sung dynasty China, Byzantine Empire, Mongol invasion, Crusades, 1159-58. The Renaissance in Europe, voyages of discovery by European and Ming dynasty Chinese navigators, the emergence of the experimental method in science, 1159-59. And then finally, because we've arranged it that way, the widespread development of science and technology, the emergence of a global culture, the acquisition of the means for self-destruction by the human species, and the first steps in spacecraft planetary exploration and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the first second of New Year's Day. Now, the idea that it is not until late evening of the last day of the year of the cosmic calendar before the first emergence of primates able to use tools in a slightly more sophisticated way than Jane Goodall's chimpanzees raises an extremely interesting question. What took so long? How likely is it? Might it be that this is an extraordinarily unlikely event? That had things gone slightly differently, intelligence of this sort would never have developed on the Earth. This is an important question for those of us concerned about the prospects for extraterrestrial intelligence. And therefore, it has prompted me to try to see what, at least I can understand, about human evolution. And so, let me now say a little bit about the origin of life, and then some more about the events in this last day of the cosmic calendar, and then go on to the question of extraterrestrial intelligence. All the organisms on the Earth are the same organism. There are some superficial differences, which many people have noticed, say between humans and oak trees, but in the deepest sense, there are no important differences. All of the organisms on the Earth use nucleic acids as the repository of genetic information, as the self-replicating system which is essential for the propagation of the species. All organisms on Earth use proteins as the enzymatic catalysts to get the work done in the cell, and all the organisms on the Earth even use the same code book to translate nucleic acid information into protein information. The oak tree can read your book, so to say. And you could read the oak tree's book, although neither of you, of course, is highly motivated to manufacture the other, and you don't have the wherewithal. Nevertheless, the genetic code is, as the biochemists say with an interesting exaggeration, universal. By that they mean everybody they know uses the same genetic code. Now, this astonishing uniformity could have two sources. One is that there's only one way to make life anywhere in the universe, and that's nucleic acids and proteins and the particular genetic code we happen to have here. That is not impossible, but I think many chemists would bet on the opposite. The alternative is that we're all the same because we're all related. that we are all evolved from a single instance of the origin of life some 4,000 million years ago, and that's why we all resemble each other as closely as we do. Now, that's an important point to bear in mind, because if that is true, it means that at the fundamental biochemical level, much less things like organ systems and writing and social organization, beings elsewhere are likely to be very different from us. The question of the origin of life is surely not the same, it's not identical, with the question of the origin of nucleic acids and proteins, but the two questions are very closely connected. So in experiments, like the one I'm showing here from our laboratory at Cornell, in which you simulate or duplicate the primitive environment of the Earth, a mixture of hydrogen-rich gases that have high cosmic abundance, nothing special about the Earth in this particular kind of simulation, what one finds is that by supplying energy to such a mixture of gases here from an ultraviolet source, that you produce enormous quantities of organic molecules, including amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and the nucleotide bases and sugars, which are the building blocks of the nucleic acids, suggesting that we are made of common stuff, that life on Earth has by and large used the junk, the organic debris which was littering the surface of the Earth, and not extraordinarily rare or exotic materials, which raises other interesting questions. One could easily imagine a universe in which what you need to make life is not what is abundant. We apparently do not inhabit such a universe. We inhabit a universe in which what is necessary to make life is made all the time, easily, from the most abundant stuff around, which, of course, enhances one's expectation about life elsewhere. Now, the next slide is a brief backwards look into the history of the Earth, and we're looking at very small things. These are photomicrographs, and each of these spherical objects is about 10 microns, 10 millionths of a centimeter in diameter. And you see that things very much the same go back to some 3 billion years ago. Well, these guys, these recent guys, 45 million years ago, back here, we would recognize nothing at all because everybody is too small to see. In any case, these guys are bacteria and blue-green algae, the sorts of organisms which we know to be the simplest sorts, in fact, the kinds that don't have nuclei, and that this simple, humble form of life arose early and has been with us for a long time since. Meanwhile, all around it, lots of other organisms are developing. Now, an important question for any organism is how much information does it need in order to do what it has to do? I mean, for example, the Viking spacecraft to Mars, which is sort of naturally in my thinking these days, is a semi-intelligent machine. It has, on occasion, to figure things out itself or do things without assistance from the Earth. To do that, it has a computer, and that computer has a certain number of instructions. In fact, it has a vocabulary of some 18,000 words. And within the limits of that information, it knows to do various things. If it is required to do a set of things which the description of which requires more than 18,000 words, it simply can't do it. Likewise, a grasshopper required to build a pyramid, despite the best intentions in the world, would be unable to do it. It does not have the information, or you might say intellectual wherewithal, to do it. Now, an organism like a grasshopper has almost all of its information pre-coded, much as the Viking spacecraft has. That is, it is information largely, not exclusively, but largely contained in its genetic material, the sort of thing that we in earlier years would call instinctual, pre-coded, hard-wired information. But even grasshoppers can learn by experience. Even paramecia can learn by experience. So it's not that all the information is pre-wired. There is some plasticity, even in very simple organisms, some ability to learn from the environment. Therefore, there are two kinds of information which organisms before human beings have: pre-wired and learnt, or as we might say, genes and brains. Human beings have added a third kind of information, extrasomatic, that is outside the body. Libraries, for example, reading material, microfilm, records, inscriptions on buildings. Anything which is not instinctual or remembered, but you have to go look at something to know what it's about, is extrasomatic. But there is, with, I think, trivial exceptions, no other organism on Earth which has a significant body of extrasomatic information. So it is of some interest to try to quantify the amount of genetic information in a given organism, the amount of extragenetic information in the brains of the organism, and the amount of extrasomatic information in the libraries. To do this, we have to use a unit of information called a bit, a binary digit, which is, in simplest form, the yes-no answer to a single question. So a good way of thinking about a bit is to think of the popular, well, at least it used to be popular game, 20 Questions, in which it is imagined that anything you're thinking about can be described by yes-no answers to 20 questions. But you can see that if you divide the universe equally with each question, then the universe is divided into 2 parts with the first question, into 4 parts with the second question, and by the time you get to the 20th question, into 2 to the 20th power parts. And it turns out there are a lot more parts in the universe than 2 to the 20th. And the reason that 20 questions works is because we have unspoken assumptions that there are a whole bunch of things that are not to be used in 20 questions, like the 137 millionth atom from the right on this rug right here. Nobody would ever get that one in 20 questions. That's thought to be too specific. Now, it is possible to make a rough estimate of the amount of information in both genes and brains of various organisms, and for the brains, we have to make the assumption that what counts is the number of neural connections, so-called synapses, in the brain. We have 2 curves, genes here, brains here, and what we have plotted here is the number of bits of information versus the time of origin of the organism now bearing that amount of information. So, for example, a bacterium arose billions of years ago, you remember the previous slide, but contains only, in its genetic material, only a few 100,000 bits of information. Human beings arose a few million years ago and contain in our genes, some 10 billion bits of information, which can be calculated from the number of nucleotide pairs in the genetic material in the 23 chromosome haploid set that human beings have. Now, suppose it takes more than about 10 billion bits of information for a human being to do what a human being has to do. In that case, a human being is in trouble unless he, she, it has an additional source of information. And that additional source is provided in our brains, and at least for most people, what we do is more determined by brains than genes, although in lots of cases it's a dead heat. And so a rough estimate of the number of bits of information in the brains of a single human being is about 10 to the 13th, about 10 trillion bits, some 1,000 times more than what's contained in the genetic material. Now, this is very rough and ready, but I think to order of magnitude these numbers are correct, which means that there was a moment in the history of life on this planet when the first organism emerged that had slightly more information in its brains than its genes. That was an epical moment symbolically in the history of the planet, although I'm sure that organism didn't think much about it. It being some early reptile in the Carboniferous period, I'm sure it didn't give a moment's thought to this significant fact. Now, I would put forward the hypothesis that a critical reason for the evolution of brains, and I'll say something more about it, there's been a spectacular growth in brains in this little period of time right here, is due to the fact that the genetic information content was saturated, and also that the rate of change of the information in the genetic material is very slow, whereas the rate of change of the information that organisms have to have faced with changing environments has to be adjustable on shorter timescales. Well, brains solve both of those problems. And this factor of 1,000 is the difference between a reptile the size of a small cat and us. And there are those who say it's not all that much difference, but it's a factor of 1,000. The extrasomatic information is way off over here somewhere, something like 10 to the 18th bits of information, and that's some 5 orders of magnitude more beyond the amount in our genetic material. In our brains. Now, that provides some perspective on why so fast. Why only lately? Because it's only lately, that is only in this last 100 million year period, that genes were saturated in information content. Now, this suggests that we should pay close attention to the evolution of brains in this region. And I'd like now to present 2 engaging observations, quite different, made independently using different material, which lead, I think, to very similar sorts of conclusions. The next slide, please, is a plot of the mass of the body of a given organism versus the mass of its brain. And while it's clear that the bigger organism in general ought to have a bigger brain, for a given body mass, birds, and especially mammals, are significantly heavier in the head than are fish and reptiles of the same mass. And that separation is so systematic and striking as to suggest that there is a real functional difference. And then when we look, next slide please, more closely at which points belong to which organisms, we find that moles and eels and rats and vampire bats, fish, crows, ostriches. But then when we start getting to the top part of the diagram, we find wolves, lions, elephant, dolphin, whales, and in here, the primates. And chimps and gorillas right here, and in fact, they all fall in this region, all the great apes. And here are the gracile Australopithecines, probably close collateral relative. Here's Homo habilis, which Louis Leakey made famous. And here's us. Now, if you look at who's up here, you find that it's guys like people, dolphins, elephants, and whales, who we have quite independent anecdotal information suggesting are smarter than the other guys. There is, I maintain, probably not perfect one-to-one correlation, but a very significant statistical correlation saying that the organisms that have the largest brain mass for their body mass are smarter. The dinosaurs over here are, compared to mammals like elephants and whales, spectacularly stupid. I mean, differentially speaking, they are the most stupid organisms that are ever around. Because they're, enormous weights, 80 tons, and then the brain, weighs 30 grams. And which is about the brain of a rabbit. And there's a lot more bulk to move around than a rabbit has. And you immediately have the sense that those guys might have been pretty terrifying killing machines or tree-eating machines, but they may have been quite vulnerable to guys a lot smarter than them. So a little hint of the primeval warfare between mammals and reptiles, which is so perfectly preserved in our myths and children's unprovoked fears of monsters, one wonders if there isn't some reflection of that in here. Now, what it says is that the step from reptile to mammal, because after all, us mammals are descended from the reptiles, was a very major step in terms of the evolution of the brain, and that the evolution of the primates, and particularly the family of man, from the other mammals was maybe not as spectacular a step, but still a very major step. By the way, notice how close on this diagram, say, a chimp is to a gracile Australopithecine. Remember that the gracile Australopithecines are associated, their remains are associated with the use of tools, and then when we recall Jane Goodall's findings that chimps use tools, and then this remarkable set of recent findings that chimps are perfectly able to communicate in languages designed for their particular anatomies. Now, this argument from the ratio of brain mass to body mass is quite separate from the next argument which I want to present to you. Next slide, please, which is due, at least in contemporary guise, largely to Paul MacLean of the Laboratory for Brain Evolution of the National Institutes of Health, and a Leakey Foundation speaker. What I have here is a very rough sketch of the brains of 5 representative organisms: fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal. And what has happened is that if we separate the forebrain from the midbrain, we see that there has been a steady relative progression of the mass of the forebrain compared to the rest of the brain. And this has, of course, its greatest flowering in us, where we are some 95% by mass forebrain. The next slide is a schematic diagram due to MacLean of the human brain. Now, MacLean argues that there are anatomically distinct portions of the forebrain in, let's say, human beings, but in all the mammals. And that the deeper parts of the brain are clearly connectable to our ancestors. MacLean believes that this innermost, deepest part of the forebrain is a brain which we share in many important details with alligators. A part of the brain which has not evolved very much from the time of our reptilian forebears. That surrounding this is the limbic system, which we share in many significant respects with the other mammals. And that surmounting all of this, accreted on top of it, so to say, is the neocortex, the 2 cerebral hemispheres, which primates, and particularly human beings, have as their proud anatomical indication of our state of advance. MacLean finds that if you take out in monkeys, let's say, pieces or cut pieces of the reptilian complex, you remove the ability to do certain kinds of behavior. Hierarchical social behavior, aggressive behavior, ritual behavior, things which reptiles do. He argues that the limbic system involves an entire new way of looking at the world, involving, among other things, strong emotions. And that the neocortex, of course, is strongly responsible for our analytic abilities, although he does not argue for a powerful, complete separation of function, and believes that some evolution in the reptilian complex and the limbic system has occurred in human beings, and that we're not identical down there with the dinosaurs, but close enough for us to have to pay attention. And this idea immediately opens up all sorts of marvelous speculations which can clearly be overdone about which kinds of human behavior are due to the reptilian complex. And, you just did a reptilian thing. But the idea that there are parts of the brain which go back very far, which were an essential part of our instinctual apparatus, matches very nicely the separation in the brain mass to body mass ratio diagram that I showed before. So two quite different approaches in comparative anatomy which give very similar conclusions. As I said, the first use of tools, as far as we know, in a characteristically human aspect, is several millions of years ago in East Africa by gracile Australopithecines and Homo habilis, and we've seen a major development in the use of tools since then, and I think it is clear that the widespread use of tools has strong selective advantage, that you have a better chance of getting food or a mate or beating off the opposition if you have tools than if you don't, everything else being equal. And I'm sure that most of you, having heard other lectures in this or similar series, know the now conventional ideas about how upright posture, freeing of the hands, tool use, all evolved together, along with the slow emergence of gestural and then spoken language. But the development of the neocortex is astonishingly rapid in that same period, and the American anatomist C. Judson Herrick called it the most spectacular anatomical development in the history of the vertebrates. I would like now to ask the following question. This sequence of events, this broad spectacle of the evolution of organisms on the Earth, reaching its latest interesting point in us, but hopefully having some long and further interesting period in the future, how typical is that of the evolution of planets? Is that a common event, or is it an extraordinarily unlikely event? So if I can have the next slide, I'd like to rapidly go through some relevant points of information. This is the psychological projective test, which astronomers call the Horsehead Nebula, for obvious reasons. The Milky Way galaxy is replete with dark clouds of this sort, gas and dust obscuring the light of more distant stars. And a very interesting finding by microwave line searches in modern radio astronomy is the finding that these kinds of clouds are full of organic molecules in very large quantities. And the organic molecules run up to 5, 6, 7 large heavy atoms. And to give you an idea of how much, there's a cloud in Sagittarius called B2, I think, which contains ethanol, the stuff that some humans like to drink. The amount of ethyl alcohol in that cloud is sufficient to satisfy the drinking requirements of all planets in the Milky Way galaxy, assuming every star has 10 planets, assuming that every planet has a population equal to the Earth, and assuming that every organism has the same alcohol consumption as Americans do. And for a period of 10 billion years. Well, there is some trouble in acquiring and distilling, but it's there to be used. Now, how is it that organic molecules, many of much greater biological interest than ethanol, including nitriles, which are building blocks of amino acids, how is it that they're sitting out there in a hostile, radiation-rich, extremely cold environment? It's another indication that making organic molecules is tremendously easy. Next slide. There are also a lot of places. This is a slide showing an extremely small fraction of the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. If you were to back off from the solar system by 30 light years, which is 1/1000th of the distance from the solar system to the center of the galaxy, and looked back with the naked eye, you would see something like this. And what is of interest is that from that tiny distance, the sun would be as bright as the dimmest star that can be made out in this picture. The sun would be, say, that guy right there. And were you to move a dozen or 2 light years beyond, the sun would be totally invisible, even to the keenest unaided human eye. So there is nothing extraordinarily remarkable about the sun. You can hardly see it from almost everywhere in the galaxy. Imagine a tiny little sphere around the sun, and only guys in that sphere can see the sun without some very elaborate technical equipment. Well, that gives us an interesting perspective on the significance of the sun and the planets, which of course you would not at all be able to see at such a distance, or even at the distance of 1 light year, in the galactic scale. In the Milky Way galaxy, which is only one of hundreds of billions of other galaxies, there are hundreds of billions of stars. The total number of stars in the accessible universe is something like a 1 followed by 22 zeros. There's an awful lot of places for an awful lot of evolutionary experiments to have taken place. And the problem is to try to figure out which is the nearest place that an interesting evolutionary experiment has occurred, which has carried that life form up to a stage where it is capable of interstellar communication, because we have now reached the point where we ourselves are capable of doing just that. The contents of messages from other societies with independent, all those things I said, biologies and chemistries and societies and sciences, would be, I think, an epochal moment in human history, the clear culmination of all of that development of tool-using and high intelligence and exploratory instincts which have been responsible for our success as a species. Thank you.
Thank you so much for